Welcome to the Great Humbling podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening.
So, Dougal, it is our last episode of The Humbling for 2024. You are looking resplendent in your Christmas jumper, sir. What is the origins of that particular piece of splendid attire?
Well, thank you, Ed. I mean, it's becoming almost a tradition, isn't it? And the difference being that this year, those listeners who wish to have it inflicted on them can go to YouTube and see the thing in all its glory with the herd of llamas singing fa la 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 llama. This was sent to me from my sister Iona in Sheffield a few years ago now, I guess probably 7 years or something. And I'd been wearing it for a while before as my friend Duncan pointed out to me that it was a reference to some computer game involving llamas that was very big amongst young people at that time. But I was sufficiently out of the loop that this had not dawned on me. But yes, are you lacking in the Christmas jumper department, Mr. Gillespie?
Feel impoverished. Well, actually, you wouldn't be able to see it because, as you can tell, I'm still in my shed despite the cold temperatures outside, mainly because the desk I usually use indoors has now been replaced with a Christmas tree for the festive season. So I've been usurped by a small conifer.
I'm glad to hear that you've got your priorities right in the Gillespie household. I'm sitting here. I started the day thawing the ice off the outside of the air source heat pump because it had stopped working, and the heat pump engineer pointed out that the first thing to do was just to turn it off for 10 minutes and to get rid of any ice on the external part of it, which sure enough has been making a difference. But I'm also sitting here with my my Swedish peppercock gingerbread cookies and my cup of coffee. So I'm all set for looking back from these last working days of the year. Feeling a bit. My mum always says feeling back-endish, and I think it's a sort of Yorkshire expression for that point where you're undoubtedly into autumn. Sort of late October is when it's feeling back-endish, but I've been wanting to appropriate and misappropriate that as a term for this moment where the big tasks of the year are done, but you've still got a few working days left to take stock, or whatever the better phrase than that is. How is it looking for you when you look back over 2024, Ed?
Oh, well, yeah, it's definitely the kind of time of hunkering, isn't it, right now? Well, I mean, I guess the big thing for us personally is the blending of family, because my partner has moved in with her daughter. So I now have 2 young girls running around the house, which is an even more relentless joy than the previous relentless joy. I've christened them the Entropy Sisters because they managed to create not just chaos, because chaos is like a state, but entropy is definitely got a vector and direction of intensification. So yeah, when you walk into a room and think, I swore I tidied this room half an hour ago. And now it seems to have been wonderfully and marvelously upended again. So that's the big thing, and that's the big joy, I guess. I mean, 2024, I don't know. It's been, well, we've talked about some of the things which have happened, but yeah, I do like these periods of reflection at the end of the year where you do get a chance to slow down and just do a bit of that mulching that is good to do, the composting, and I've just put my new poetry book out as well, which has been...
What's it called? Give it a plug.
It's called The Father's Road, which is quite a personal collection of some of the poems that I've written over the course of my parenting journey, with a few others sort of sprinkled in there as well. So out now from Etsy.
Well, congratulations on the book, Ed, and congratulations on the weaving together of the families as well. It's lovely to hear about.
It's the important work.
Yeah. Well, I'll look forward to the next time that we have a chance as a family to visit you guys, so that we can, so that Alfie can get caught up into the chaos of the Entropy Sisters. I'm sure he'll have his additions to make. It's funny you talk about slowing down, because we've just come out of a really joyfully busy weekend, where on Saturday we had the annual Christmas dinner for the committee that runs Skogsvallen, the folk park, the outdoor music venue that we've been talking about off and on the show, and that marked, I realized, a year since Anna and I joined the committee, because it was like going to the Christmas dinner was the first thing we did when we joined last year. And well, absolutely. Yeah. And we did, we've sort of done the same again. There have been various new members who've been co-opted since we joined. So there's a real kind of renewal going on within that crew. But also there is that joyful thing when you mark a year and it can tell you the difference between where things were a year ago and where they are now. And for us, it was just sitting around that table with this group of people who are now friends. And, many of whom are deeply rooted in this community where we're still very much newcomers. And so then on Sunday, we were over for lunch to some friends who went through a really tough time earlier this autumn, but it was also one of those reminders of how you're brought together and how friendships kind of move into a new phase. Yeah, really, you find out what matters to you when things get difficult. And to have been part of the little group of people who gathered around and supported this family, and then to be going over and them having made a beautiful lunch for us, it was another moment of, we've really traveled a long way on the road into being a part of this place and the people who live here. And the day continued with sort of the dropping in at the 43rd annual peppercorns party, gingerbread party of the couple who live a few doors up the road in that direction, and then going to the church Christmas fair and Lucia concert with the children's choir. And so I'm not sure about slowing down yet, but this particular Advent has definitely told me something about the journey that we've been on as a family over the past year.
Lovely. Yeah, we had our Loddon annual Victorian evening last week, which is where various different people dress up in Victorian garb and attire.
And send children up chimneys and bring out pain and
all the good old days of Christmas. Sort of that, bring back that Dickensian vibe. But it's funny because they have like a Punch and Judy show, which is slightly reconstructed for the modern age, I would say, in the fact that the domestic violence seems to be evenly meted out by both Mrs. Punch and Mr. Punch, so it's very egalitarian. And then the fire station opens up and all the kids get to fire a fire hose, which I'm not sure what the connection to that and Christmas is, but they love it.
Always a winner, though, isn't it?
Always a winner. Yeah. And then there's some local Shetland ponies, which they put antlers on. They look like the least convincing reindeer ever.
Oh, well. So the other thing I was thinking about looking back on the year is I was recalling the various occasions on which, and this must happen to you as well, Ed, I hear from people who we've talked about on episodes of The Great Humbling, and it's this reminder.
It is a flame.
Well, one person who shall remain nameless told me that I think he said this, that his wife nearly drove the car off the road in surprise because they were on a journey together, and he put The Great Humbling on, and then suddenly we were talking about his work. So it's a reminder, because these episodes go out to 1,000, 1,500 listeners, let's say, typically for an episode. So it's it's a fairly intimate community of listeners, but many of whom have traveled with us some way, and many of whom know we're connected in one way or another to people who we find ourselves talking about. So I talked about that book, 999 Years of Peace, that was produced as a outside of the market economy publication where it only travels as gifts. And I got a lovely email the other day from James Calen, the author of the book, who had clearly heard word that we'd been talking about it. And I'm still reading it and really enjoying it. I might try and get James on a Homeward Bound episode sometime next year and talk to him a bit more about the way that he's trying to use fiction, but also about the experiment of that way of publishing. But anyway, that's those are some things that I find myself reflecting back on. And then I realized I had one other thing to report, and I was looking around the house trying to find this so I could wave it around at you. But Bagthorpe's Battered, the final volume of the Bagthorpe.
You got it.
We got it. Actually, I've not mentioned this because it happened in between series. It just, after various people making real efforts to try and track it down and us getting nowhere, I suddenly got an alert in my inbox in June, and it was just in time for Alfie's birthday. And so for his 9th birthday, he got a copy of the 10th and final installment of the Bagthorpe saga, and chose to have it read really slowly, when you're kind of eking out something, knowing that there's not going to be any more of it. And I won't try and give away too many spoilers, but what I can say is I did wonder whether Helen Cresswell had sort of somehow consciously, after nearly 25 years she spent writing it, woven together all of the threads of these hilarious, brilliant, massively underrated books. And I don't know whether it's actually sort of left unfinished and she had the intention to carry it on or not, but it ends with a freeze frame, as several of the earlier books in the saga do. But there's also a little nod in the way that it's worded to kind of, well, how else could the story end? So, the entropy siblings of the Bagthorpes and their wider family continue the madness through to the end. And if you can track down a copy, then I highly recommend it. Somebody should try and get the publishers to bring the whole series back into print, because it really is a classic of late 20th century English children's literature that has not been sufficiently valued.
Well, I love the fact that you closed that particular circle, but where did the book come from? Where did the copy come from?
It was I guess it was ABE Books. So it was right. I'd set up a notification if or maybe it was even eBay. But basically it came on and wasn't even being sold for
money.
Eyebrow raising amounts of money, just for an ordinary second-hand book price. So
word would go around, you see, it's like word goes out in the book world that Dougal Hine is prepared to pay anything for part 10 of the Bagthorpe saga. It's like someone's going to close a killer deal here. Pressure's on.
There we go. So any other loose ends that you want to tie up before we head into what we've been reading and into the questions that you've brought for today's episode?
I think we should get stuck in.
Let's do it.
So what have I been reading? I haven't got it to wave around, actually. I've been following up on reading Patrick Barkham's The Swimmer by actually reading Roger Deakins' Wildwood, and An Adventure Through Wood. And it's just beautiful. It's as you'd expect. I can't believe I hadn't got around to reading it before, but it's classic Deakin. It's the book he wrote and finished just about before he sadly died of that brain tumor at quite an early age. And yeah, it's the usual magic. He takes you from Woodhenge off the coast of East Anglia to artists working with wood, to actually the deep relationship he had with pretty much every beam and piece of wood in the farmhouse he restored in Mellis, because he'd literally shaped or recovered them from other abandoned farm buildings. And it's just beautiful. It's very much about, a man in relationship with another element. And it's the sort of tragedy is, having written Waterlog, which was very much his connection with the element of water, and then obviously focused on wood, you wonder where he would have gone with fire and metal and air too. It would have been intriguing to see where he might have taken those elemental ideas of journeys through the world.
Yeah. Oh well, thanks for sharing that one with us. I've got one with me that Alfie and I've been reading that sort of sets us up for what we're going to be talking about in this episode. Because
have that on my shelf.
Do you? Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? I think it was 2011 this came out. Alan Garner's Collected Folk Tales. There's a quote on the back from Philip Pullman where he says, "The great collections of British folk tales, such as this one, should be treated in two ways. First, they should be bound in gold and brought out on ceremonial occasions as national treasures. And second, they should be printed in editions of hundreds of thousands at the public expense and given away free to every young teacher and every new parent." I don't want to take away from the truth of that statement, but it is worth saying that this is not a collection of British folk tales. There are British folk tales in here, but there are tales that have traveled far and wide. And it's not, these are not tame stories. They are really pretty wild and they go to strange places. And I was curious what Alfie was going to make of it, because, often the way that stories are retold for children kind of builds up a certain set of expectations. And then you get to something like the Voyage of Maldwyn in here, where sort of 22 different weird islands from this old Welsh story, where basically at the beginning there's 3 people too many on the boat. They've ignored what their shaman said to them, and as a consequence a storm blows them off way off the edge of their knowledge of the world. And I mean, it's a little bit like a kind of raw pagan version of what C.S. Lewis was somewhat taming in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There are a few moments in it where I really thought, I seem to remember this coming back in Narnia. But
little Welsh Odyssey.
A little Welsh Odyssey, quite. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like the kind of the genre of the sailors off course being bounced around between different islands has a lot of different versions of it. But anyway, there's all sorts of stuff in there, highly recommended for grown-ups and kids. So yeah, folk tales, folklore. Ed, this is where you wanted to take us today.
Yeah, I just had an inkling that it would be great to have a discussion about. I think the original idea was like the consolations of folklore. Why is it so connecting? Why do we have these deep relationships and affinity with it, even as you say, when it goes wild and weird and doesn't quite make sense? And having read some of those stories to my daughter too, it almost, I don't find it quite so surprising that the kids love it, because when books like that or tales like that make great leaps of imagination, that's often the way that kids tell stories, isn't it? Where, their narrative is not linear, and it can go off in very odd tangents and directions. And in a way, maybe that's why they love the folk tales so much. But no, I was just having perhaps a kind of winter indulgence on, the times when folklore has been really important to me in my life. And I think we touched on some of this way back in early episodes, but for me, my deeper connection with it was originally through, the great Martin Shaw and the School of Myth, which I happened into, at a very critical point in my life. And I don't know whether I was looking for it, or whether it was the serendipity that was needed. But it caught my imagination at exactly the right time, and helped me through what was a quite sort of transformative set of ordeals that I had to go through. So that's why I was really interested. And I love the fact that you immediately brought in Alan Garner as the kind of the precursor, because obviously he doesn't need any introduction on this particular podcast. But there was a quote I had from him which has said, the job of a storyteller is to speak the truth, but what we feel most deeply can't be spoken in words alone. At this level, only images connect, and here story becomes symbol. Symbol is myth, and myth is truth. And I think one of the key consolations for me is always how you're being connected to a deeper truth. And even when the story is weird, there is meaning in it, even if you can't necessarily always consciously understand what that meaning is. And always go back to like moments on the School of Myth where Martin would interrupt the story and have a pause and ask the audience, which images have you connected with? What are the moments where the hairs have gone up on the back of your neck or on your arms, where you've had an embodied and physical reaction quite unexpectedly to a story that apparently you've never heard before, or perhaps haven't heard told in that way. And it was amazing to then hear different people in the room who'd had those moments in completely different parts of the story, some commonality, but it was clear that there was something deeper going on, when you heard something, but you physically recognized it as a truth that perhaps you hadn't experienced, but certainly you had some connection or knowledge of.
Yeah. There's a sort of diagnostic power there in that particular part of the way that Martin works with myth, isn't there? I've also, as you were saying that, because I'd been wondering about this language of consolation, but as you were talking about it, I was remembering, you've probably heard Martin say this as well, that there was a point in his childhood where things got really bad in his family. And it was actually Alan Garner's novels that I've heard him say they saved his life, that there was a sense of being able to climb inside a book, being able to climb inside a space of myth, and that giving you like an extra layer, an extra body that allows you as a child to navigate bad times. And I think, this idea that there is medicine in story, I want to just probe a little at this, because when you first suggested it to me, I said back to you a few weeks later, I said, so we're going to talk about the consolations of fairy tales. And you said, no, the consolations of folklore. And I don't know, do you want to just expand a little bit on what folklore as a word or as a frame means for you? Because I want to sort of think about it a little bit historically as a way into this. But what does that, what's the particular resonance of that, or the boundaries of that as a frame for you?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. For me, there is a sort of, the folklore is the sort of wider landscape of which fairy tales are, one particular territory. And in which, you also find tradition and ritual, and an interaction between all of those different things. So I think I wanted to just take it a bit wider than just fairy tales and folklore. And I think that's because, we've now had a couple of outings of our Molly dancing group. We were dancing at Pakefield, just near Lowestoft, near the most easterly point of Britain, on Saturday night, as the storm Dara was blasting in.
Wow.
And we thought we were going to be dancing, right on the coast. Could we dance whatever the weather, pretty much? So gale force winds and horizontal rain. But luckily, we were sort of in not quite the eye of the storm, but the calm. And as we processed, with our sort of fiery torches and our blackened faces, with the band of female musicians, with all of the ivy and the winter green in their hair, it's a real spectacle that stirs something. And it very much is like, one of our rules is no smiling. It's not, you don't come in grinning. It's supposed to be a little bit intimidating, and people absolutely love it. And I think it serves a real function. So I wanted to keep it wider like that, because it's funny how these traditions, maybe and this is part of the discussion, is like, in times of uncertainty, they seem to hold greater power. I don't think there's any accident that there's perhaps more people Morris dancing in the UK now than there has been, since the 15th century, and probably many more than ever were, because the population is so much bigger now. But there's apparently 15,000 people regularly Morris dancing across the country now, and I think that's fascinating.
As you were talking about I was just imagining being a stranger coming upon the gang of you without knowing that you were going to be passing that way, and the extent to which, you're sort of bordering onto the tropes of folk horror, which is, a particularly British genre. I mean, when I hear or use the language of folklore, for me, what it invokes is a particular history in which, I don't think folklore as a category would have made any sense in the time of Shakespeare, because low and high culture had not parted ways. Such as, yes, there were beginnings of some real differences, and obviously the Reformation had already kind of kicked in. There were beginnings of real differences between how seriously people in the urban and rural settings took the presence of the modern human world, the presence of the kind of beings that are showing up in Midsummer Night's Dream. But it's somewhere on the journey beyond that, on the journey through the 17th century and beyond it, that this kind of gaping chasm opens up in worldview. I don't even like the word worldview, in way of inhabiting the world, in assumptions between a new kind of educated elite that has been on this trajectory that will get redescribed later as disenchantment, under the influence of both the new science and the new economic rationalism, and such that somewhere down the line their sons can rediscover what's on their own doorstep as something wild and exotic. And so I think, I haven't gone back and checked this, but I think that if we were to look for where does the term folklore come from, it comes from people of educated and privileged background becoming curious about the strange beliefs, stories, and practices of their family's servants and tenants, and having gone through a period of just looking away from that, because that's part of how this journey of separation goes, returning from it with a distance that means you can be an anthropologist in the village where you're the son of the lord of the manor. And there's an episode in one of Alan's later novels, Strandloper, the early part of that, where you have, the son of the local lord who is he's really curious and wanting to ask questions about these local traditions. And that's also tangled up with kind of political edges of political radicalism in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And the upshot of it is that this bright working class rural man gets exiled to Australia when the let's say folkloric practices that happen in the church on the occasions which the vicar is not invited to get busted by the authorities. And so I guess I wanted to sort of put that on the table, that we even have a term or a concept of folklore seems like a product of both an alienation from tradition and ways of inhabiting place and ways of being in relation with, let's just say, an animistic world, a world that is made of beings rather than a world that is composed of dead matter in the kind of Cartesian and Newtonian, or sort of post-Newtonian sense. So, but also of a nostalgia or a homesickness, a longing, a sense of loss, which I don't think is false. I think that, and I was thinking as we were preparing for this, I mean, yes, we've talked about Alan Garner a lot over the years. And in my 20s, I had these sort of three masters who were the people who, through books, and then I actually stumbled into getting to know them or their friends, but who formed me. And one was Alan, and one was John Berger, and one was Ivan Illich. In a way, Alan's sort of role is the most subterranean, because Illich and Berger you can clearly see as theorists and as kind of writers, especially in Berger's case, who were very influential for me in learning to write the kind of writing that I do. But Alan is kind of mostly known as a children's novelist. It's not a term that he would ever have fully inhabited, and it certainly doesn't fit the second half of his career at all. But that's where he's been positioned within the maps. But I think that what mattered to me viscerally and intellectually from when I was very young, discovering his work, was that here was someone who, unlike those kind of 19th century parsons and sons of Lord of the Manor, who were doing often important work in the kind of study of folklore, Alan was somebody who came from rural working class craft culture, had a direct living connection to it, went off through Manchester Grammar School to Oxford to get the best of the fruits of this thing that had branched off in the other direction as the elite intellectual culture of modernity, but then turned away from that career and dedicated himself to a costly journey of reintegrating the two things and modeling that in a way that is, that I continue to steer by. So yeah, that's sort of those are some of the things that came up for me when you brought us this as a theme to talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about that sense of loss, because you hear it in the sort of dismissiveness. You think when we refer to being, disenchanted, it's always a sort of depressing or disappointing thing, isn't it? Whatever you're disenchanted with, it's like, oh, I found that so disenchanting. It's like, it's heavy, isn't it? It's like that loss that we discuss, and even the kind of the way that we talk about like folklore or myth as weak things. It's like, oh, that's just folklore. I.e., that's not substantive. It's not empirical. It's not got a foundation of evidence, or and even worse. I was guilty of this, talking about myth busting. It's like that's a good thing. Where clearly it isn't. But I mean, one of the questions I had for you, Dougal, is are there particular stories or myths or bits of folklore that you go back to that are particularly resonant or important to you?
Well, I think for me, it's often been to do with the teller. And so I'm back again with Martin and various stories that I've met through his work over the years. But it's also, I have a certain caution around the ways in which the stories are often offered to us directly, starting from here, which maybe has something to do with that history that I've just been tracing. And there's an essay that Alan Garner wrote for the New Statesman in 1970. And there can't be many things that were published in the New Statesman in 1970 that would be worth bringing up, not as part of historical archives, but as living stuff to think with. But this one is, and it is called, I can't even remember what it's called. We'll put it in the show notes. But in it, he talks about what he calls the spiritual gelignite of myth. And the essay is a review of somebody's book of retellings of classical myths, and it's, at one level it's an absolute hatchet job. It's just like, this is a terrible thing to inflict on children. But in it, Alan sets out 3 ways in which myth can work with and work on us, or 3 ways in which people can work with the material. And so he says, on the one hand, you can have translations of existing texts, and that can be a perfectly legitimate academic activity, but it's going to be like, butterflies pinned in a case. It's not going to have, there's not going to be something that's alive in there. Some people may be able to bring their imagination to and work with the results of that in such way as to then create something that's alive. Then you have retelling, which is how the stories and myths are often given to us, which is, someone takes a translation or a historical text and reworks it in such a way as to put it into an accessible language. And that's the stuff that I'm mostly a bit suspicious of or underwhelmed by. And then there's a third thing, which is, Alan describes it as, the writer may reabsorb and transmute, often subconsciously, the elements of myth. So to answer your question, for example, the Owl Service, which is one of my favorites of Alan's books, is grounded in his reabsorption of this myth that's there in the Mabinogion, the Welsh collections, which, the way he retells it, what's so chilling and powerful about it is, it, in the form of a modern novel, it becomes about a story that is repeating itself down the generations. In each generation, a triangle of people end up caught in the spell of this story. And each time there is a moment where another path could be taken. And if that moment is missed, then the spell is still hanging over the valley. The possibility of breaking the spell has to wait another generation. And what happens, which is often, I used to struggle with this sometimes as a kid reading these books. In Alan's books, you'll have a character who you've found the least appealing of the central characters. Often the one who has kind of gone on that journey of losing touch with the things that matter deeply and gone off into the rational, into the academic. And who, at the right moment, as the story is reaching its end, makes the surprise move that fulfills the possibility that the story could turn out otherwise in this generation. And that's me describing at quite an abstract and sort of schematic level. But so, I would say that Martin, who probably looks a lot more like a reteller than Alan does, nonetheless, the reason why I'm drawn to his work is because he knows full well that you have to swallow the apple and be changed by it. And, that something very costly has to happen before you're ready to tell a story. And it's rare. It's rare to find people who are, we're back to why I talk about stand-up comedy as one kind of shamanic practice that's indigenous to modern urban white culture, that, if you find something that is labeled as shamanism, it's probably historical reenactment, or at least the people who are drawn to it are going to be wanting it to be true and wanting it to be powerful. Whereas you go to a good comedy club and the audience is stood there leaning back at the beginning with their arms folded going, go on then.
Yeah.
Go on then. And like it has to actually work rather than you having a group of people who are willing to pretend that it's working when it's not. And so that's my sense of smell is always drawing me to like, where is there something that's really alive? And so when we're talking about all of this, then often I think the places where the myths are alive are places that are not clearly labeled as that, in the way that you could pick up any of those early Alan Garner novels and they're not being labeled as, here is a retelling of this ballad or this old Welsh story, but that's, Alan's fully aware, and if you read his essays, he'll reflect on the extent to which that's what's actually going on there.
There's a great line in the Owl Service when you describe one of those characters where he says, he's so far gone, he's on his way back.
There you go.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that sense of something being alive in the story as well, which brings me back to that weirdness bit, because like some of the stuff that I always go back to is some of those First Nation Native American like creation myths and trickster stories.
Yeah.
And I remember Martin telling a couple, about how Muskrat basically sort of births the world out of his own bum. And they're quite scatological. And then there's another trickster one where, Trickster has the ducks which he's cooking over the fire. And he wants to have a sleep. So he tells his bum to watch over the ducks. And of course he wakes up and the ducks have been stolen. And so he burns his own bum with a stick as punishment, and then goes off on a walk and keeps finding bits of very tasty cooked fat on the ground and is following the trail and going around in circles and basically eating the bits of his own burnt bum.
No wonder kids love this stuff.
I know. Well, and I remember Martin telling these stories and saying, he goes, the first couple of years of the School of Myth are quite difficult because, people felt like they'd paid to come and hear me tell these really scatological stories. And it was like, I was hoping for something a bit more sophisticated. But again, there's a sort of weird magic power to those stories. The more you get into them, the more you get into like the Winnebago cycle of trickster stories in particular. And I think that's the stuff that I'm often drawn to. And I think it's because it's going to lead to a piece of work for me next year. But that sort of, mischief that matters, the playfulness, the world slightly turned upside down is the bits that kind of excite me. And folklore and myth is absolutely fantastic for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking some more about this, this sense of the kind of, the being lost in space quality, or away with the fairies quality of modernity.
Again, it's that negative thing, isn't it? It's like going, oh, you're away with the fairies. It's like, isn't that a good thing?
Well,
or an ambiguous thing, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, right. Okay, so let's see if we can do something with that. So isn't it a thing that might have something to teach us? And so what was getting me thinking about this, and we've touched on this once or twice before, is there is this whole thread around re-enchantment that's going on at the moment. And, my old friend, Mary Harrington, has just written a really fascinating series of posts on her Substack. And now, Mary's quite located within Consolations on the right, in a kind of conservative intellectual or even reactionary culture that might be pretty alien to a lot of folks who listen to The Great Humbling. But she was one of the people, the main person who in my 20s I was kind of thinking with about Garner and Berger and Illich and so on. And even if we then kind of went off in our different directions, it's quite exciting to me to see her returning to some of that territory from where she's thinking now. And she had a series of posts. The first one was called Woke is not the new Reformation. And then one called Scrolling Towards the Divine. And then another one called Yes, the Woke Right is Real. And I'm not going to try and summarize everything that she's thinking through in those, but there's a thread within it which is about the return of pattern recognition. Because the other thing Mary's always been fascinated by is the history of sort of literacy and how it's transformed by the internet. And so she's saying, one of the things, maybe one of the reasons why the world is getting re-enchanted in people's experience right now is because our way of navigating in this sort of mimetic space of the internet reactivates pattern recognition as an epistemological approach. And that actually brings us full circle, because it takes us back to the idea that there is a kind of reality that inheres not in the specific instances, but in the things that those specific instances have in common, a reality of forms and a causality of forms. And this gets a bit sort of technical and philosophical, but here's the bit that struck me in one of these posts that Mary wrote. So it would seem that a chain of scientific discoveries, and she's talking here partly about the implications of quantum physics, a chain of scientific discoveries has brought us full circle to the metaphysical point we abandoned in order for modern science to begin that journey of discovery in the first place. 700 years of nominalism, which was the philosophical turn in the Middle Ages that sort of set up the modern scientific project and involved a turning away from the idea that there might be underlying common forms that mattered versus a studying of, what ends up being the world of dead material nature. 700 years of nominalism gave us first the scientific revolution, and then ultimately that revolution disproved the nominalist revolution's own central contention, namely that formal cause has no reality. And for me, there's an echo, there's a resemblance between that pattern of that journey and what I was describing to you before about this sense of Alan Garner mattering to me because he brings something home rather than getting stuck out there, in outer space in the way that those who began to frame this concept of folklore, this kind of alien enchantedness, seem to tend to have done. And then I remembered something from the anthropologist Levi Strauss that came to me from this book, The Ends of the World by Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveros de Castro. It's a collaboration between a philosopher and an anthropologist. And they have this passage that I've kept coming back to where they say, maybe, as Levi Strauss often remarked, science, which started out by separating itself from myth, will eventually encounter it once again at the end of a kind of double loop. And there's this...
Circles do join up in the strangest of places.
Well, maybe it's a stranger pattern than just a circle. I don't know. But the sense of, what if we retell the story of modernity and of that journey into modern science? And this is what I think I'm hearing between the lines of what Mary's writing, as a kind of, far from it being what it presented to itself as a revelation of the really real, from all of the delusions that people have been living with until the Enlightenment switched the lights on. If instead it's a bit like having been away with the fairies, it's a bit like having been off, on this whole thing that was resting on an acting as if that was indefensible, but that nonetheless brings gifts. And then the work is to bring home those gifts. We're back. I mean, there's another version of the hospicing modernity story in this somewhere for me. I don't know. I mean, Ed, where do you want to take this before we bring it into land?
I mean, in a weird way, because you're asking some big questions there. In a weird way, the essence of some of this is the fact of having some comfort in not knowing,
Right.
and maybe that's the sort of humbling angle on some of these things. There's a reassurance in the fact that you don't always have to, as I say, deeply understand a myth in order for it to have meaning. And I like the inhabitants of some of that uncertainty. I like some of that mystery and intrigue and not being able to nail it all down into a sort of fact-based map of where we are. So, I mean, I guess the thing that I like about some of the deeper psychological truths, particularly in terms of that pattern recognition that, Mary Harrington's describing, because I think that chimes a lot with the work of Jeremy Lent in The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning, about how do we build our collective understanding. And in a sense, when you talk about the technological stuff that's going on, and I've done a couple of talks on our relationship with technology recently, a large language model is essentially a pattern recognition machine. The way that those ChatGPT large language models are operating is essentially pattern recognition and prediction of what is likely to come next. And, when you have the potential for quantum computing to then take that to an exponential level, so to have, if you like, the ambiguity of a machine which is not binary in the way that our technology functions at the moment, it's either a 1 or a 0, because the qubit, the basic component and building block of quantum computing, can be in all of those states simultaneously and all the states in between. And in a way, that's a really powerful metaphor for the way that we see the world. And I would say that potentially takes us to a place where science comes back through whatever spiral loops you've just been describing into a territory of myth.
I'm thinking, as you're saying that, of James Bridle's book, New Dark Age, and where he keeps coming back to the cloud of unknowing and this kind of medieval mystical text as having a lot of medicine for the times.
It's a good term for the modern internet, the cloud of unknowing.
Well, exactly. That's one of the things that he's kind of playing with in there. And he also talks about sort of folk epistemology. He talks about conspiracy theories as folk epistemology in one of the chapters in there.
I have purchased this to.
Right, great. American Cosmic. There we go.
The new year.
We have some fun ahead of us in the second half of this series, Ed. Once you've read that, then we'll be really out in the weird territory of the kind of new Reformation that Mary is talking about. But the other bit that I sort of, yeah. So there's that cohabitation with the unknown, and when myth was kind of packed off up into the attic like a box of toys that we'd grown out of, because now we have the direct knowledge of the Enlightenment. And so myth becomes something for children rather than something for all of us. One of the things
or an insane relative.
Well, right. Yeah. And one of the things that is lost in that is the capacity for cohabiting with the unknown, rather than the unknown merely being divided into the stuff that's not real and the stuff that will one day be known, which is a kind of colonial relation to the unknown, where the unknown becomes simply territory to be conquered. And I think part of this re-enchantment, or maybe it's not even a re-enchantment, because maybe we were never fully disenchanted. We were just under a very strange spell for a few centuries in certain parts of the world, and that spread out its grip further and further. But part of that is a becoming reacquainted with, re-inhabiting the skills of cohabiting with the unknown, rather than needing to assure ourselves that we'll know it one day soon. So the other piece that I wanted to bring in before we draw this to a close is something else that I learnt from from Martin, and which I'm sure you'll have heard him talk about this, but that came back to me lately for another reason. So I've heard Martin say on various occasions, when you're learning a story, you should never try and tell it until you've got to the point where you're able to inhabit every character in that story. Till you've got to the point where like none of the characters are alien to you. And what brought me back to that was that I just finished Wendell Berry's big recent book, The Need to Be Whole, which is an extraordinary, challenging book. And one of the passages in that that's really stuck with me is where he's writing about his friend Ernest Gaines, who's a Black American novelist of the same sort of generation as Berry. And, you know, Berry was born the same year as Alan Garner. So we're talking about these old men from the 30s. And Gaines died a few years ago. But Berry had known him since they were quite young. And Gaines's influence is clearly strong in the thinking that Berry is doing in The Need to Be Whole. And there's one bit where he's talking about a novel that Gaines wrote in the 80s called A Gathering of Old Men, which is set in Louisiana in the sort of the world of the descendants of the plantation slaves, where people are still having to live alongside each other in the kind of the ruins of that system. And the bit that brought Martin's advice back to me was Berry's talking about a moment near the end of the book, where the sort of villain of the book, a character called Luke Will, has turned up at the place where the action has been taking place, basically thinking that he's about to lead a lynching, and finds himself instead facing a dozen and a half old black men, all of them with their shotguns, and realizes that there's a real likelihood of the tables being turned. And there's a moment that Berry homes in on where he says, you know, as Luke Will's situation dawns on him, he turns to his friend who's with him. He says, if you make it and I don't, look after Werner and the kids. And Berry says it's a really moving moment. He says, if Ernest Gaines were the sort of writer who likes shortcuts, who thinks the purpose of a story is to deliver a moral message, he would need only to withhold his imagination, and Luke Will would be stereotyped as the white racist whom all the politically correct people love to hate. And I find that important and challenging, not least because I get sent a lot of books that, frankly, are doing exactly the thing that Berry is saying Ernest Gaines is not doing, where they are withholding the imagination from the people who the author does not like and does not imagine any of his readers will like. And it occurred to me that maybe one of the, whether it's the consolations of folklore or the powers of it, is that right now, in a realist setting, it can be very difficult to ask people to extend their imagination. I think we're suffering from a desperate failure of the imagination. I mean, when I see people who have been shouting loudly about the wrongness of voicing conspiracy theories about elections when the other party wins, and who turn on a dime and are, shamelessly promoting conspiracy theories when the party they wanted to win has lost, or when I see people who are, shouting about the threats to democracy, real enough of an incoming government, and turning on a dime and, cheering and celebrating extrajudicial killing, with no, there is a failure of imagination going on in our political discourse right now. And to try and ask people to make the leap of imagination within the real, within realist fiction that is attempting to address the contemporary situation, it's probably not going to work. But maybe through that kind of inhabiting of myth, where actually the characters often are archetypally black and white and evil and so on in ways that don't work in realist fiction. But to say even those characters, you have to get inside them. You have to know the part of you that is that character in order to be able to tell the story. Maybe there is a ground on which it's possible to be training, recovering the kind of imaginative capacity that Berry is asking for. I don't know. That's something that sort of came to me as I was preparing for today and thinking about, what the roles of myth, what the places that myth allows us to go, what the sort of, for all that it's spiritual gelignite, that it also provides certain kinds of zones of safety for thinking things and saying things and feeling things that we might not allow ourselves to think and say and feel within the space of whether it's political discourse or realist fiction.
Absolutely. And I think, that comes back to this point that, the stories don't always make logical sense, particularly in myth and folklore. But what you then also get is this potential for possibility and impossibility and improbability, the things that might not seem rationally, logically, sensibly possible, can become so when you allow your imagination to be stretched. And I think that's really important. And one of the quotes that was rattling around with me in advance of this was from the American folklorist Alan Dundas, who said, "Folklore provides a socially sanctioned outlet for the discussion of the forbidden and taboo, and allows us to step into difficult territories and terrains." But essentially, where we find ourselves now in the context of culture wars and that divisiveness, and as you say, a failure of imagination, which can bolster your own judgment and perspective, but then dismiss or denigrate another's. And I think that the myths that we have as a shared inheritance are part of the ways that we might be able to kind of work our way through some of those big differences.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope that there are some strange places off to the side of the way that we normally think about and talk about the world that we can invite each other to and be changed by the experiences of, and that these things that aren't marked on the maps, because if everything that's real is everything that's marked on the maps of things you're meant to take seriously as a grown-up just now, we're in pretty deep trouble.
Yeah.
Let's hope as we look towards the new year that those kinds of capacity for surprise that we're talking about here might offer us some paths beyond where this map full of dead ends seems to be leaving us.
Have yourself a mythic little Christmas.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @FruCall. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.